Good evening, everyone. This is Simon from the Institute of Applied Psychology, and welcome to our webinar tonight on breaking bad habits. Thank you for joining us this evening. You'll see a Q&A option on your screen. Please feel free to ask any questions in there as we progress tonight, and we'll then address as many of them at the end as possible. But for now, I'll hand over to Gordian Young, the founder and lead trainer at IAP, for tonight's webinar.
Thank you, Simon. So tonight's webinar is entitled Breaking Bad Habits Using Hypnotherapy. So the first thing I think I need to do is highlight a bias that I have. My bias is that hypnotherapy is arguably among the most effective therapeutic tools you could ever have. And although not well known in Australia and obviously not exactly mainstream in many sort of people's thinking, hypnotherapy overseas has an enormous following. It is considered among the pinnacle of therapeutic approaches. The school that I learnt at in Arizona, the Milton H. Erickson Foundation, is considered not just the pinnacle of hypnotherapy training, but arguably the pinnacle of all therapeutic training around the world. So my bias is that I think hypnotherapy is a significant tool, and as a therapist, you should probably be across it. Now, that's not all hypnotherapy. There's different types. Certainly the type that I use and the type that I teach is fairly rare in Australia. The only way I got it was to be in the States. So I feel very privileged that I have this very unique model. But that's my bias. I'm stating it up front. I want you to be clear about my thinking around that. So let's start off with, what is a bad habit? Well, basically a habit is a pattern of behavior. What we tend to do when we run a habit is we go fairly unconscious. The nature of an unconscious pattern is that we don't have to think about it. It's an autopilot. We might be responding to some sort of urge of some kind. It is habitual, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end by definition. But in essence, it's not a problem unless the client says it's a problem. So we've all got habits that other people might consider to be bad habits, but whether we want to get rid of them or not is a whole other discussion. So when someone wants to change a habit, hypnotherapy is one of the most effective ways of doing so. But of course, if they don't want to change a habit, hypnotherapy and pretty well nothing else on the planet will change it for them. So what are the most common bad habits? Well, I looked this up actually this afternoon. A bad habit is basically characterized by an outcome being frequent and negative of some kind. So according to some online surveys, the top 10 most common bad habits are smoking, drinking, nail biting, eating fast food, procrastinating, online surfing, sleeping in, watching trashy TV like reality shows, Facebook, and credit card spending are the top 10 most prevalent negative habits. So what makes a habit a habit? Well, typically people claim behavior as just a habit, and there are no really underlying causal factors. So sometimes people will say to us, in clinic, that my smoking is just a habit. There's no other reason why I'm doing it. Well, sometimes that's true, but the vast majority of the time, people don't really understand the causal factors. They don't understand the internal mechanisms that feed the habit. So how do we determine if a habit's just a habit? Well, a key question is, what do you get from the habit, smoking, drinking, eating, whatever you want to call it, that you don't think you can do for yourself? To me, that's the pivot point question. And the answers will vary. Sometimes it'll calm you down. It will make you feel relaxed and make me feel more comfortable. So calming is one of the options. Or I'll get a buzz. So people feel excited, people feel alive, people feel some sort of confidence because they've taken that drug or substance or engaged in that activity. So when people can clearly see that they get a benefit, because all habits run because there's a benefit. You don't run a habit because it's a negative, because it's just a no issue. The truth is, even though you might consider it a bad habit, you get a benefit out of it. It gives you something. Now, sometimes people say nothing. It doesn't. I don't clear myself of anxiety. There's nothing that happens. There's no real feeding mechanism behind it. And sometimes that's true, and again, sometimes it really isn't. Sometimes I'll ask them if they're anxious of any kind of anxiety, and the answer will be no. And I'll suggest that they go 2 days without a cigarette, and they'll tell me very quickly that they can't do that because they'll be anxious. So that kind of tells me the anxiety is in fact a factor here. So here's the thought for you. If it's a habit, and someone's brought that habit to the clinic, if it's a pure habit, it's easy to change with hypnotherapy because there's very little complexity to it. There's going to be very little resistance to it either. But one of the questions I'm going to ask them is, if it is just a habit, why haven't you been able to stop it yourself? Why have you come to me? If it's just a bad habit, there's nothing else going on, what stopped you? Now, how they answer that also is very telling. So can hypnotherapy help with habits? Well, the answer is yes, in a general sense. But let me offer you something that's a little bit more refined. The truth is, questions like, can hypnotherapy help you with this or that? Or can CBT help you with this or that? Or can psychodynamic therapy or ACT or anything else? The truth is, no therapy works per se. There's no such thing as hypnotherapy can help, because there is something called the holy trinity of therapy. There are three factors here. There's the practitioner. So you could have a very good model, but the practitioner is not very good. As a result, it's not going to work. You could have a great practitioner and a really ordinary model. So I think some models of hypnotherapy aren't particularly useful in a lot of contexts, but the practitioner could be very good at what they do and still manage to get through it. And the third, and probably the most significant factor as far as influence in the outcome, is the client. So client variables are a very big part of how the outcome is created. I've had some people say to me, you saw a friend of mine and in one session he stopped smoking. And I want that too. And then when I talk to them, it's pretty clear to me there's a number of factors that differ. They don't smoke for the same reasons as their friend did. They don't have the same motivation to quit the way their friend did. And their smoking pattern is more complex because not everyone smokes for the same reasons. Some people smoke because they're anxious. Some people smoke because it gets them away from the office. Some people smoke just because they're bored. Some people smoke just because the habit is just to have one with a coffee. If it's purely habit, it's easier to resolve than if there are other factors. And the truth is, you must go after those other factors because, in fact, they feed the problem. If you just pull the smoking away, I keep talking about smoking as an example, but if you just pull the smoking away, the trouble is those other factors have not been dealt with, and you're likely to get a relapse of some kind. Or in fact, they'll turn to some other substituting type behavior. So, as I said, across the board, hypnosis can readily address something that's really just a habit. All hypnosis approaches have the advantage of working at that non-conscious space. So the truth is, because habits are non-conscious, you don't have to think about them, they are irrational by design, then non-conscious forms of therapy are arguably the best ways of dealing with them. If you consider intrusive thoughts, anxiety, depression, phobias, PTSD, addictions, they all have largely unconscious behavioural patterns to them. Truth is, logically, we know what we should do and what we shouldn't do. We know that pursuing that behavioural pathway doesn't really honour us. But it's like we have two brains. Our frontal lobe kind of knows, that logical brain knows, this is just stupid. Why am I doing this? And another part of your brain goes, but I kind of feel like it. I need it, and and argues. Well, tomorrow you'll feel really bad about it. And well, no, we'll leave that, right now. And so there's really like we have two brains, and that conflict is part of what we have to deal with as therapists. So most people don't really know that there are actually two main bodies or forms of hypnotherapy, and there's some sub-branches in underneath it all. There is traditional hypnosis and there's modern hypnosis or hypnotherapy. Traditional approaches tend to read you a script, or they predominantly tell you to stop the behavior, or tell you that the behavior will have a negative consequence. So they might suggest that if you light up a cigarette, it'll taste like an ashtray. A lot of aversion therapy, things like that. My first training was in traditional scripted hypnosis. You don't need to learn a lot of psychotherapy around it because you're pretty well just going to tell people what to do. That's very different from modern Ericksonian or neo-Ericksonian method, where we're not going to read a script to you at all. We're going to build a case against the habit, and we're going to build a case for alternative behavior. And we're going to do it by listening to you as a client and using what's referred to as your experiential language. That is, I'm going to speak to you in your terms. If you're a mechanic, I might use a mechanical form of metaphor. If you're an executive, I'm going to speak to you very differently again. So how we get outcome is that we tailor the response to you and your circumstance. There's no point me reading a script to you about quitting smoking when in actual fact you're not smoking for the reasons that are in the script. Everyone smokes for different reasons. In fact, the idea that you smoke just for one reason doesn't make a lot of sense. In my experience, people smoke for a range of reasons. The cigarette over breakfast with a coffee is not a stress cigarette. Whereas the one at 11:30 in the morning, or the one at 2 in the afternoon downstairs outside the building, that probably is. So if you recognize that a lot of what we call habits actually have a feed, and it's either to calm you down or give you a buzz of some kind, and that your brain has made the association that this substance or this behavior will make you feel something, then that's where we have to deal with it. Ultimately, they're often underestimated. And so if you don't deal with the underpinning or the feeder to the habit, then you're not going to get long-term outcomes. I see a lot of people who have been to other hypnotherapists or other forms of hypnotherapy, and they've told me that they felt good for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, and then it all kind of fell over. Well, that's because traditional hypnosis does not deal with the underpinning issues because they don't really believe there are any. It's a completely different therapeutic model. And here's the thing, I was trained in traditional hypnosis first. I spent a whole course reading scripts and analyzing scripts. I did this back in the 90s, and very few of us actually went on into becoming a real actual therapist. But for me, I just felt like it wasn't enough, and I pursued modern hypnotherapy, and I found my path, so to speak, over in the States. So I'm just going to quickly show you something here that really is one of the underpinnings to the way we think about hypnosis with the modern strategic hypnosis that we teach. This is too complex for me to explain in any real depth here right now. But in essence, any kind of thing, let's assume that the problem is almost addictive. then I know you have certain patterns and certain requirements that are feeding this addiction. So the very first pillar here is something called a low tolerance for discomfort. What that really means is when a feeling comes up that you don't like, and it might be boredom, it might be neutral, or it might be tense and might be agitated, then you will go looking for something that your brain has linked to a better feeling. So the more you have a low tolerance for discomfort, the lower your capacity to just sit with a feeling you don't like. You'll go searching for that substance or that behavior that really helps you step away from that feeling. You'll also run a duality. The second pillar there is a duality around that substance or that behavior. So part of you will know it's a really dumb thing to do, or it's got out of hand, it's now out of control. Another part of you will want it anyway. The third pillar is an external locus control. So all that really means is you don't believe you're in control of it. And for me, that is the underpinning to all therapeutic problems. If you don't believe that you get to control those thoughts and those feelings that you run, or at least you get to control which ones you listen to. Here's the truth. There's something like 60,000 thoughts you have a day. The pivot point of your life is determined by which ones of those thoughts and feelings you pay attention to and which ones you choose to ignore. There's not a person on the planet who doesn't have negative thoughts or doubtful thoughts or sometimes self-criticism of some kind. The key is the people who seem to function better are the ones who just don't tend to listen to them. The people who have trouble are often listening to thoughts and feelings that just don't serve. And the trouble with that is those thoughts and feelings actually lead behavior. So when you don't feel like you're really in control, then these behaviors, these patterns can start to get out of hand. And they get it becomes even a bigger problem when you have something called a poor attribution style. How you attribute is how you explain the world. And typically, if you get stuck in this sort of behavior or these sort of substances, then your attribution style is poor because you start to explain the world in ways that don't serve. So the classic methods are to say things like, I don't really have any choice here, it's genetic. Or I'm just like my father, he was this way too. Maybe it's in my DNA. Or because of my childhood, or because of my past, or because of my controlling mother, or something other, I don't have a choice. Now, intellectually, we know we have a choice, but a lot of the time people don't think they have real choice. That is a problem. And when you give it an explanation, I don't have a choice because, that makes it harder to deal with. This combination of external locus control and poor attribution really are saying that I would tackle first targets in any hypnosis session. So to fill this in, basically, in hypnosis, I'm going to tackle each of these pillars. As I hear them in you, I'm going to tackle them. Now, the next one is an internal focus. You can't really run a behavior with a clear external focus, not one that you don't really want to run. If your attention is out in the real world, you are able to step away from any thought or feeling you're having, and you can be more discerning. And the other factor is anything that is a bad habit where you find it hard to stop, you are in something called a present orientation. So every problem has something called a time orientation. Anxiety is a future orientation. So you go into the future and catastrophize and imagine things going pear-shaped. Depression has a past orientation because you keep going back over your past and doing this post-mortem, how you should have done better and how you've amounted to very little, and so it goes on. Well, anything that's addiction, compulsion, impulse, it all belongs in the present orientation state. You really focus on how you're feeling now. And as a result, you will either negotiate your way into the behavior or out of the behavior. Now, there'll be moments when you negotiate your way out. But when you're in the problem space, often you'll negotiate your way into it. And to do that, you have to ignore consequence. You have to ignore how things will be tomorrow, or how you're going to explain it to your partner, or whatever else it is. You're going to have to ignore it in preference to focusing on what you're feeling right now. And the last pillar there is something called an avoidant coping style. And that is to say that rather than deal with issues head on, to deal with the micromanaging boss or the difficulty of communication with your partner, you're going for something other. You're going to placate that feeling. So an avoidant coping style does not deal with the problem, it deals with the feelings that the problem is creating. So as a result, you're mostly focusing on comfort and trying to get back to something that's comfortable internally, but that doesn't really change anything. You know, if you go home after a hard day at work and you eat a bucket of ice cream, that's not solving the problem at work, but it is easing the discomfort in you in that moment. You might feel pretty bad about it afterwards, but in that moment, you thought it was doing you some good. So there are these rituals that these habits can create, and ultimately, it's about either moving towards something that you prefer or it's moving away from something you really don't want. These pillars that you see here, the Gordian pillars of addiction, there's a set of pillars for virtually every problem that you're ever going to see as a hypnotherapist or therapist generally. These are unique to us as a school. I created them. They're part of a book that one of our graduates, a university professor, is currently editing. And this makes it very easy for you to be able to break down a problem. The piece underneath the pillars is really about things that can sometimes be part of it, but aren't always required for the behavior to run. So that's how we will tackle it. It's a much more thorough intervention that's just telling you to stop it or to suggest to you that next time you think about it, your brain will just say no and you'll walk away. That can work for people. It does, particularly if it is just a habit. But the moment we start to have some complexity in the problem, traditional really falls flat. So my experience and the experience of a number of hypnotherapists that I've retrained, who are traditional hypnotherapists, I've retrained them. In some cases, they're actually trainers for us now, is that their success rate used to be around about 30%. And since then, they expect about a 90% success rate now that they're doing this type of work. So as I said before, if you don't address the feed, you'll pay the price. Relapses or substitutes. You know, the classic with smoking, of course, is replacing the cigarettes with sugar. That's a classic substitute because you haven't actually dealt with the underlying issue. You haven't dealt with the compulsion or the feeling they're trying to placate. That is going to mean you're going to end up going back or replace. So the other thing about how do you do that? You know, what is a pattern? It's a process. It's a series of steps. As we said before, you go unconscious, responding to an urge of some kind. It is habitual and it has a beginning and a middle and an end. But it can be challenged at any aspect of this process. So for instance, if you remember back to a time when you were engaging in a habit that you knew was not ideal, let's put it that way. Remember what you were doing, maybe a craving. Remember a time when you had a craving and really go back in your body at that time and remember what it felt like, see what you were seeing, hear what you're hearing internally, and go back and feel what it was like to have a craving. Now, some of you will be able to do this and others might find it more challenging, but look at the physiology you've dropped into in order to have a craving. A craving is actually a form of tension that you create. So your posture will probably slump a little bit. Your breathing will become more shallow. You'll go into thought as you keep thinking about what you want to do that you know you probably shouldn't. You'll hold a level of tension around it. Maybe the internal dialogue will be pushing you and urging you to just this last one time, or don't worry about it, doesn't matter this time, it's okay. And you'll look to justify it in your head. So there'll be a demanding, well, probably more of a demanding voice inside your head. This is the process. This is a set of steps. These are component parts of running a craving. And what happens is when you indulge in it, whether it's a cigarette or food or alcohol or whatever, you actually start to breathe again and you'll lift your posture and ultimately feel better. But the truth is, what we haven't understood is that this habit in itself is a process. This craving itself has a set of steps that you could interrupt without the smoking, the drinking, the eating. But we just don't really know what goes on inside our head most of the time. So I know some of you are, well, a lot of you, I'm guessing, are online because what you want to do is find out whether becoming a clinical hypnotherapist is a good idea or not. Well, as a school, we teach something called the Diploma of Clinical Hypnosis and Strategic Psychotherapy. It is government accredited. It's being re-registered just in the next couple of months, just renewed again. It's been upgraded again. And you'll go straight into an association you're doing it. So the question then becomes, is this what you want to do? Is this of interest to you? I can tell you now there's a need for decent hypnotherapists. For the last AGM, I think around about June, it was announced that there are only 521 clinical hypnotherapists fully qualified in the association across all of Australia. That's 521 for 25 million people. And hypnotherapy is an increasingly sought after model because it's actually quite pleasant. Most people actually enjoy coming to see you because it's such a unique experience that they're getting. And it gets outcomes really quickly. You know, if you're working with someone and it takes you 6 sessions or more to get an outcome, then you weren't doing something right. There should be some sort of improvement, in many cases a significant improvement, in one session. That's even if you're fairly new to this. That should be fairly doable. So the question that becomes, is it right for you? Could you do it? Are you set up for that? Well, if you're good with people, if you've got some maturity and you've got some, miles on the board, you've been through life, you've dealt with a few things, you add on the pillars and you've got a really solid model that you can run. So that's a fairly large commitment compared to this that we're running in some cases this weekend. We're also running a hypnosis certificate, a weekend training, just 2 days. In Sydney and Melbourne, it's actually this weekend. In Perth and Brisbane, it's in a few weeks from now. The full price for this is $790, but right now, and I don't actually know how many seats are left in this, it's $489. And you can go online and book it yourself. You could also call us on that 1300 number. So, can hypnosis affect habits? The answer is absolutely yes, but we must have a client who wants to play. You must be decent as a practitioner. The model is sound. There's no doubt about it. For me, if someone comes back to me for a second session and says nothing's changed, I've got red flags running because that just doesn't happen. And I'll want to discuss it and find out what happened here. Typically, they didn't do their homework. So they only listen to the recording once, which was in the office with me. So I always record everything I do and give them recording, because repetition is the mother of skill. The more they listen to something, the more they get it. And in addition to that, of course, no one can really just sit with me for 20 minutes and listen to every word I say when they're in trance. They're going to drift. They're drifting off to different places. They'll think about what they've got to do on the way home, and then they'll bring their mind back, just like meditation. It's the same point. They'll have trouble staying with me. So when they listen to the recordings over and over again, they will actually pick up everything I've said. So typically, that's the reason why things haven't changed that much. The other option is, of course, sometimes I think things haven't changed, but the truth is things have changed a lot. They just haven't really picked it up. And in a discussion, they'll suddenly, at some point along the line, they'll say, actually, I think things have changed a lot. I just didn't pick it up. So they're the two main reasons why. But I want you to hear that if someone isn't significantly improved by the second session, something's not right with that in my head. That just doesn't happen. Such is the predictability and the reliability of the model that I've got. And again, I'm just very fortunate. And I spend a significant amount of money getting it. I spent over $100,000 on my education. We're not asking you anything like that. So I wasn't saying that was pretty foolproof, because I don't tolerate uncertainty very well. I don't want to sit with you for hours or weeks or months, not really knowing if we can really get an outcome. I'm just not willing to do it. I want an outcome. I'm very results oriented. And most of the clients who come to see me are too. If you want to talk about it for the next 6 months, then I'm not the person to come and see. That's a different type of therapy. So this is saying that you can come and you can just have a play for $489. It's definitely worth just coming in and having a play and learning. By the end of it, you'll actually know how to hypnotize someone without a script, say something useful, and bring them back. You will actually be able to do hypnosis. You're not going to be covered off for everything that someone's going to come across. And the idea that 2 days would make you a hypnotherapist is just a little bit ludicrous. Of course not. You wouldn't want someone who's only trained 2 days working on you. So that wouldn't be something I'd suggest to anyone else either. Having said that, there are courses out there that promise you these sorts of things after 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, and it just isn't really valid. So I don't know what questions you have. Simon, are you able to... Are there questions there that...
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, Gordon. For anyone else out there who wants to pop through a question, you can use the Q&A panel on your screen. The first question tonight: a friend of mine had gone to a hypnotherapist and stopped smoking in 2 sessions. I went too, but it didn't work. Why would that?
Before. So you may not be smoking for the same reasons. You may not have the same motivation. There's different points. Sometimes people are so desperate to give it up, they just can't really work out how to do it. You may not have been there. And maybe the model or the approach didn't really work for you. So those client factors I talked about, maybe you didn't resonate with the therapist as much. My guess is that would have been a traditional hypnotherapist. That would be my guess. Ultimately, you should be there with a therapist more than 2 sessions typically, unless it was just a habit. And maybe for them it was a habit, and maybe for you it wasn't such a habit. Maybe it was you had anxieties or other concerns or irritations you were dealing with, and as a result, you weren't willing to give it up just because someone told you to stop. So that would be my guess. Unless you deal with a feeder, you're not getting an outcome, and you can't really deal with all the feeders, which is all the pillars that I showed you, in 2 sessions. It's not going to happen that way.
Yeah, we do. How long, how much is the accredited diploma course?
the accredited diploma course, it's 16 days face-to-face over about a 4-month period. So 4-day blocks is typically what we do. In Perth, we're doing weekends as well. And then there's a fair component that's online as well. The face-to-face days are predominantly about experiential learning. So we want you to be practicing a lot there with other members of the group. What's important in that context is that you do get to work with different people, and you will learn that you can't do the same thing with everyone and get a solid outcome. So the class time is mostly for the experiential stuff. A lot of the basic foundational knowledge stuff is delivered via online sources. So we give lectures online. You can do your assignments and assessments online. And but you have something like 40 weeks to complete all the assessments. It is a government accredited training. You don't get it without doing assessments. So basically 10 months. Although if you're effective and you know how to organize yourself, some people do it in 4. So that's really how long it takes.
What other applications does hypnotherapy have besides working on bad habits?
The applications of hypnotherapy are endless. Really, wherever the mind has an effect on the outcome, you can use hypnotherapy. I mean, what you're really doing is working with the potential of the client's mind. That's why this idea that hypnotherapy in itself cures something, it just doesn't really work that way. What a good hypnotherapist does is tap into the potential of the client and ensures that we have tailored the approach and sold or built the case for a better behavioral pattern or for a new way of thinking that is more useful, more empowering. The skill of the therapist is knowing how to get you out of your own way. So everything from pain management, where actually hypnosis has the most research going back 80 plus years. Anything to do with anxieties, anything to do with phobias, anything to do with depression. You know, anxiety is probably the biggest thing I see. It's almost a plague these days. Study skills, procrastination, better confidence. You know, our levels of confidence are largely unconscious to us. You know, when people are busy telling themselves they're not good enough, that's been almost a lifelong problem they've run. And the truth is, it's a fabrication. There's no way you can not be good enough. Because when I ask people, not good enough to do what? They can never answer that question. They never even ask themselves how valid that concern is. So anywhere where it's largely an unconscious process, hypnosis is a great vehicle for getting in and helping the person change something that's been conditioned into them over the years, and pretty fast. I mean, the most I've ever seen anyone has probably been about 11 sessions. And that was someone who was so chronically depressed that she had to be helped to walk into the office. The vast majority of people I'm going to see is 3 to 6 times. So that's 3 to 6 hours, 3 to 7 hours, something like that. And we can achieve, in many cases, what people tell me is a lot more than they've achieved in sometimes years of other forms of therapy. So I wouldn't be without hypnosis. You know, I'm very clear about my bias. I have hypnosis, I have NLP, I have some other variables. I've really explored lots of things, but I keep coming back to these two because they just work and they give me certainty. And I know that if you walk through my door, and assuming your head doesn't spin all the way around, I have an outcome for you. I can do something with you. I wouldn't necessarily be that certain about some other models that I've explored. So that's why I like it. It really can do almost well, I don't want to say anything that's not really quite true, but things that are physical problems, warts, psoriasis, immune system deficiencies. There's so much that can be done. We're just hitting the tip of the iceberg now. It really comes down to, does the client believe it's possible? If the client does, you're likely to get an outcome. Yeah. Simon, is there anything else?
One final question was related, rather than a bad habit, and the person who asked this might feel that it's a bad habit, but they were saying they have a habit of seeking approval and wanted to know whether hypnosis can help with that.
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, a lot of people consider that a habit, but that excessive need for external validation that you're talking about, that is because you've got a set of pillars behind it. So if you don't really understand how to assess yourself realistically, you're like to either overshoot or undershoot. And what sounds like you're doing is undershooting. If you don't know how to recognize your own abilities, then you're typically going to be looking for someone else to recognize it for you. And this can have a significant impact on your life. You're always at the behest of what other people think of you. But here's a thought for you. I don't know that you really need other people's approval. The truth is, if I told you, and I don't know you, but my guess is if I told you that I thought you were wonderful, my guess is you would do something with that. You would basically dismiss it or just suggest I'm being nice or projecting or something. But if I criticized you, you'd take that to heart. If my opinion was truly what you needed, then surely you should take my compliment and my criticism and with equal weight. But you don't. Because what you're really worried about is that your view of yourself is actually shared by others. That's what you're really concerned about. So when you keep putting yourself out there, please, you're looking for that validation, it's because you can't tolerate the uncertainty of whether people like what you did or didn't. So you keep asking, you keep looking and hoping and waiting for it. And then you can be okay with you. The truth is, what you don't have is a high tolerance for the unknowns of life. What you don't have is a recognition that it doesn't really matter what other people think. The only validation you really need is from yourself, because that's the view you're concerned about being out there. You don't like the idea that what you really think of you is actually shared by others. That is something that hypnosis can definitely help with, but not with a script and not with a single session. It needs to be dealt with all the factors I've just alluded to. That's a complex problem, really. There's a number of significant cognitive distortions you're running to get there. So the idea that you just get zapped and then nothing, you'll never think that way again. There's no switch in your head, as a lot of people want me to do. They'll come in and say, can you just switch that light bulb off in my head and I won't drink as much or whatever else it is. That's a real simplification of how your mind works. But if you tackle it properly, is it doable? Yeah, absolutely. But it must be tackled properly. Okay. So if you are interested in this weekend training, please, by all means, go online. You can see it there at our website, hypnotherapy-weekend-course. You can sign up online. I don't know how many seats are available. I know Sydney is pretty well full. I'm not sure exactly. Let me look at the board. It looks like that's either done or might have one or two seats left from what I can see. And I'm not sure about the other states right now. So if it's of interest, I think this is a wonderful space to be in. I used to run my own business. I used to be in promotions. I couldn't say that I affected people's lives every day. But I do now. I know that I have an impact on people's lives. I have an impact on people that I've never met. Because when I help a parent, a child, I affect the entire family. I feel pretty honoured that I make a difference in the world. And it's because I have this model. It's because I've come down this line. It's not because there's anything special about me, except that I really pursued something and I've learned it well. So if that's the sort of thing that's important to you, you'd like to have that, knowing that sense of purpose and that you can really make a difference, then come and have a play. Come for a weekend, see if it's something you can do, see if you like it, and then decide what your next step would be. We'd love to talk to you about it. We have a need for great hypnotherapists. There's not a lot out there. And hypnotherapy and the position of hypnotherapy in the therapeutic community is only going to improve because it's got to catch up with what's happening in the States. It's got to at some point. So you're very welcome to come along, and hopefully this has been of benefit to all of you. I wish you well. Simon, do you want to sign this off?
Thanks everyone for attending the webinar tonight. We will be sending a recording of tonight's webinar out by email in the next couple of days. And we will see you all hopefully on the weekend or at our diploma very soon. Thank you.